Okay, we should start. It's a pleasure this evening to welcome back Don Bates, who for a long time was an influential and admired teacher at the AA, and who is now a kind of finished work on the project in Melbourne, has returned to win the large project in Bristol while having other new projects in China. So it's very kind of him, amidst all this, to kind of find time to return here. Don was educated at the University of Houston in architecture and then studied at Cranbrook. He then came to the AA and ran together with Raoul, who was here the other evening, an intermediate unit 10. He ran that for 3 years with Raoul and 3 years for himself. And on a kind of personal note, I must say that when I started at Alvin's invitation, the lectures in 1985, Alvin was assuring me that soon I would have a larger audience. But in the first year, it basically consisted of what I described to Alvin as Peter, Don, and some mad woman from Yale. Alvin said, "Tell me about the mad woman from Yale." He worked with Danny Libeskind on the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and in 1990 set up the entirely independent program, LoPSiA, the Laboratory of Primary Studies in Architecture, which was based in France. I mean, they used to, as I recall, split their time between Paris and La Brie. In 1993, at the invitation of Alan Balfour, he returned to the AA, partly in order to help set up with Jeff the graduate design program, and partly, I think, to do the communications unit. At the time, he and Peter Davidson formed Lab Architecture Studio, which, as I say, is currently engaged in major projects in China. Don is also currently Associate Professor of Architecture at the Cooper Union. I'd like you to join in with me in welcoming Don Bates.
Thank you. It's interesting to be back in the AA after so long, although I usually stop here whenever in London. And it's really with people like Mark Cousins that made the time here in London and at the AA so important, and continues to make it so important. So, within all of the debate about where this school might go, one should never forget what it's already done through people like Mark and Robert and Carlos and Raul and such. I wanted to start off just, for me it's interesting being here in London, of all places today, when I really should be back in the States casting my vote, which I actually have already done, but given that my vote is in Texas, it probably doesn't mean as much as it would have in Ohio or someplace else. But in that context, it was interesting. I mean, the election in the States, as we all know, wherever we are in the world, is highly divisive. I mean, at least the population in America is highly divided politically because of the current administration and possibilities about the future. But for all of that, it actually been quite amazing. I mean, as an American who is used to sort of hiding a bit in shame when it comes to elections because most Americans don't tend to vote, it's been a kind of watermark year in that people have finally understood the importance of the election and have chosen, it seems today, in incredible numbers to go out to vote. And so there's a kind of optimism that comes out of this incredible antagonism that exists within the country. And therefore, I actually found, I arrived on Friday and came to the lecture by Renewal on Friday night. But I was a bit taken aback when I heard that earlier in the week that some students had been told that they really shouldn't go to some of the lectures, that they were told either by tutors or by I don't know who exactly, that they really shouldn't listen to some of the people that were invited here to talk. And it seems to me that that's really both unacceptable but also out of the spirit of what this event is really about. Because it seems to me that it's only by being made aware and having some sort of background on possibilities that any sort of future development may happen. So I hope, you know, if not to use America as any kind of an example, but I would hope that the spirit of knowledge and information in order to make a decision is more important than personal prejudices. Let's see. I wanted to start off. This was a quote, a little statement I read in an article by Gerald Rubin, who was setting up a research institute, and of which there are many of in the world. But I was curious about whether this notion, the deletion test, could apply to the AA. Because it seems to me, with the experience I've had here at the AA, but also, I guess in a certain sense, any aspirations I would have for the AA, is whether this is relevant. That is to say that what takes place here in the AA is so unique, is so particularized, that it can't be eliminated. Now, one could say, well, maybe that's a kind of judgment that one could make currently, both historically and within a kind of contemporary condition. Or it may well be that that's also the sort of underwriting ethos for making a decision about both the direction in terms of a future chair, or whatever the position is called, but also about the structure. I mean, earlier today in the afternoon, there was a discussion about the unit system, which is a fundamental discussion, obviously, about this institution. But I think deeper down even than the kind of structural condition, and possibly even deeper down than the sort of leadership issue, is the question of what is it about this place that sets it apart? What is it about this place that sort of takes it beyond any place else? And it's more than just a kind of league table, you know, to see who's on top of the league. You know, it's interesting if you go to, I look at this website quite often just to see what students are talking about, sometimes about friends I know, and it's interesting to see it. But one of the things that happens on this website a lot is a kind of discussion of where should I go to school? Which school is best? Should I study in Europe? Should I study in America? Which school in America? And it's interesting the degree to which certain conversations revolve around questions of, you know, which one is at the top of the league? Which one has the most votes? Which one was considered? Now, it's interesting in America, I'm always struck by the fact that the universities in America that are always put at the top of the educational league are almost always the least interesting schools of architecture that I know of. And I assume that's because the criteria that are used to make those tables is based rather on amount of facilities, ratio of students to teachers, how much you have to pay, how many go on to go to graduate school, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me probably a better criteria, a sort of better way of trying to frame the question is this question of a deletion test, of what would architecture itself be missing if the AA did not exist? Because I think you have to take that kind of, you know, position, a kind of in position, which is not just about, you know, what can we do to make it a little bit better, playing around the edges, finessing this, finessing that, but actually to take the sort of in condition and say, well, what would it be not to have the AA? Would it just be sad and an interesting history that one could write about? Or would it be fundamentally effective for it not to exist? As Mark said, I just want to go through very quickly a little bit of background for myself, if anything else. My undergraduate studies were at the University of Houston back in the 70s in Texas. And the University of Houston then and today, 30-something years later, is still basically the same structure. And it's a structure that's very similar to many American universities and schools of architecture or colleges of architecture, which is to say that there's a kind of progressive sequence from first year, second year, third year, fourth, and fifth year. And traditionally, each year is sort of managed or coordinated by a year coordinator. That is to say that everybody in that year basically does the same project, although they do it perhaps under the instruction and leadership and guidance of different tutors and such. But there is a sense of coherence in the sort of structural formation of each year, and therefore the sort of progression of one year to the next is somehow structured. It seemed to be ordered. It seemed to have a logical sequencing. And at the end, as a kind of culmination, is seen to be comprehensive enough for everyone to have participated in a kind of well-rounded, well-grounded architectural education. After that, and after working for a few years in Houston, then I went to graduate school at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Very different kind of structure. Again, different partly because it was a graduate school, not an undergraduate school, but also different because it existed within an Academy of Art as opposed to a university or a polytechnic. And really it had one teacher, Daniel Libeskind, and some students. There were 13 of us that were there. And so the structure was really more almost like an atelier, more like a sort of direct connection with one individual, one particular sensibility to architecture, and a fairly intense, although not intense in terms of lots of hands-on instruction. In effect, a lot of it was actually the studio itself, which was sort of self-generating and self-referential in the sense that we learned from each other as part of the studio at least as much, if not more, than learning from Daniel. Partly that was because that's his temperament, partly that was because he was busy doing other things. But it was also because we were fortunate, the time I was there, the same time Raoul was there, to have, I think, a very powerful range of individuals who happened to come together for very strange and peculiar reasons at that one place. The one thing that was, one of the interesting things about being at Cranbrook is Libeskind had a sort of particular pedagogical structuring, which was that if he didn't really think you were going to be very good as an architect, you got to have a degree in 1 year. If he thought you had a little bit of promise, then you got to pay to be there for 2 years. And if he really thought you should, you might actually achieve something, you got the privilege of paying for 3 years of graduate study and staying there for 3 years. But it was an incredible experience, and it's certainly one that was very influential for myself and many of the people that were there. Coming out of that was the opportunity to come to the AA, not as a student, but as a tutor. So that in '83, Raoul and I both came from Cranbrook after graduating and came to London to set up Intermediate Unit 10 at that time. And again, I just tried to sort of diagram to my own self some of the differences between some of these educational structures. And so it seemed to me that there's a very, very specific sort of, we all know it, you're here, you're a part of it, so there's not really that much to say, except that it still is quite amazing to me that within the scale and the breadth of this institution, the degree to which certainly in the 80s when I was here in particular and a little bit in the 90s, the way in which there was this clear sort of very thin management. That is to say, there was the chair and then there was everybody else who did the work. which is not to say that the chair didn't do the work. It's just to say that there were no intermediate levels, and there were no intervening levels in between. And that's actually quite rare, I think, for any sort of institution to be able to operate on that kind of structure. And I think it's something worth describing and discussing, whether one accepts it in its finality or not. But it also meant, and this is something I'd like to talk about later a bit more, it also meant it implied a great deal of responsibility to the chair. It implied a great deal of responsibility not only in structuring and choosing the staffing of the institution, but also in being highly aware of all those levels below the line, so to speak. And I think that's quite interesting, because it's a kind of direct engagement which is usually transcended by secondary levels and degrees in between. After being at the AA for about 7 years, and for all of its opportunity and all of its possibilities, for one reason or another, I felt like the work that I was interested in doing wasn't able to be done here. For all of the numbers of years that Raoul and I were teaching here together and separately, no matter what it was that we did, and with all of our students all passing except for one, over that 7-year period, all passing part 1 or part 2, whatever they were doing, there was still a continual kind of questioning of was what we were doing really architecture? And you know, I mean, after a while you say, well, okay, forget it. I didn't say forget it in any sort of way of anger, but it was just, it seemed like it was time to try something else. So I started this thing called LoPSiA, in France. One, because at that time, in the early 90s, England wasn't a wonderful place to be in. It was very difficult to be here, I think, at that time, and it seemed like something else. Also, was fortunate to be part of an association of other architects and artists who had taken ownership of 34 apartments in the Unité de Habitation in Briey-en-Forêt by Corbusier. So part of setting up this school in France was to have a studio for 4 months in Paris and then for 4 months in the Unité, and to live and work in this building by Corbusier. But the real impetus was really sort of these sort of categories, you might say, or these thoughts. I was actually very seriously interested in what does it mean from the point of view of a student in particular to know enough to know what one doesn't know. That is to say, how do you make a choice? How do you make a choice about educational institutions? Because it seems that the sort of paradoxical circumstance is that if you are a true student, then you don't know. And yet, you still have to make a choice in order to begin knowing what to know. I was extremely lucky in that I chose the University of Houston, not because it was a good school, and not because I actually knew anything whatsoever about it. I chose it because I could get state tuition, and because it was close to where my relatives lived, so I could stay with them. It was only later that I found out that for all of its sort of backwardness, it was actually an incredible school. So for me, this question of how do you choose how to begin is an important issue, an important question that one can look at. I was also very much interested in what does it do both to me as a teacher, but in some ways, more importantly, what does it do to a student to engage in study knowing there's nothing to be gained? That is, there's no degree, there's no certificate, there's no accreditation, it doesn't lead on to anything else official. And yet one, and some students, you know, I had maybe 25 over the 4-year period, chose to do it. Not only to come there, but to pay me to do it, to pay me to teach them. And it seemed to me I was interested in what would be the circumstance, the pedagogic circumstance of having everything and nothing at stake. That is to say, everything at stake because it's a choice, it's a decision of one's own volition, and yet there was nothing to be gained. There was no point beyond the education and what that might mean. And third, I was interested in this question of, it was funny because I had gone back to, after being at the AA and after having worked for Daniel and him winning the Jewish Museum, the Berlin Museum competition, and I went back to Houston before I started this school in France, and one of my professors from there, looked at the work and said, the reason you're able to do all of this different stuff is because you had a really good grounding in sort of basic architectural education. And I was at the point of wanting to start a little institute. And it seemed to me that this was a difficult question, Did one have to know something first in order to be able to deviate from it? Was there a kind of background knowledge that one must obtain as an architect in order to then decide that wasn't sufficient, that wasn't appropriate, that wasn't really the way architecture needed to be practiced now and today? Because it seemed to me I understood the condition of it, but it seemed, it seemed inefficient. The idea that you had to spend time learning something you knew you didn't agree with at the beginning. That you knew you had a problem with the tradition or the conventional, and yet you had to go through it in order to be able to deviate from it. And I guess finally, I was interested in what did it mean to, quote, not have an institution, not deal with the sort of institutional question, both in terms of grades, accreditation, but all of those other things. Now, what I found, which is one of the reasons it closed after 4 years, is that I became the full institution. So I had to do all the letter writing, I had to do all the banking, all the accounting, all the dishwashing, all the publicity, everything else, and it just became a bit too much. After that, I came back to the AA and various other things happened. Been in Australia for the last 7 years, very little teaching there, just mostly working on a project. And then more recently have been re-engaged to teach at Cooper Union in New York. And again, I just wanted to try to schematize in my own mind some of the differences between that school and the AA, and to look at some of the ways in which different sort of structures may or may not exist. And so, the Cooper Union has always had a kind of sympathetic relationship to the AA, but it's still a very different school. It's a much smaller school. I'm in charge of all of third year, which is 27 students. So it means the relationship is very different. But even in that, which means that the whole school of architecture is about 125 students, first year through fifth year. And yet, even there is a dean, and there's an associate dean, and there are sort of secondary structures. So again, even relative to the AA, there's a very different kind of construction of how that institution operates. I think importantly, it's also, and this is something that I think needs to be understood, is the way in which the AA traditionally, at least my experience, structures the year. That the year, at least here in most units, is a sort of one thematic that runs through for a whole year, that one stays with the unit for a whole year. At Cooper Union, you do that as well. So when you're in Design 1, Design 2, Design 3, you stay with the same group of people all year. But traditionally at Cooper, it's also split up into two very different kind of projects. So you do something the first semester, something else the second semester. What I didn't show, for instance, for the University of Houston, is that you have different tutors, totally different people leading you from one semester to another. Other schools like UCLA or Ohio State have trimesters or quarter system, so that you're with different tutors every 2 months or every 10 weeks or something. These are important kind of structural relationships that get set up, and I think they're important to speak about and what the consequence of some of that is. At Cooper, once you get into the fourth year, it gets divided into two sort of sections. So you have one group of tutors for the first semester, and you have the second group for the second semester. Once you get to thesis, then you do a thesis project for the whole year. And there's a group of sort of thesis leader and associates that work through and give direction, but then it's sort of self-directed. And that's very traditional to a lot of American schools, that the fifth year is a kind of quote-unquote thesis project. I was interested in assassination, not for any particular reason in terms of enactment, but in terms of, I always used to think that assassination didn't matter. That a government, a country, an organization, that structure carried forth no matter what. But I've changed my mind. I actually think assassination is important. Again, I'm not advocating assassination. I'm just saying that it's effective. That one can see historically, certainly in my lifetime, the role of, particularly in America, the role that assassinations played. As horrific as it is, it's also effective. And it's effective, I think, because within the question of structure, institutional structure, there is still the role of the individual, of all the individuals who are part of institutions, but particularly roles of leadership. And so one can debate questions of what kind of structures want to be adapted, altered, exchanged. But it is also inherently tied up to questions of leadership and therefore questions of an individual. This is not about glorifying individuals. This is not about setting up sort of personalities. But it is to say that individuals with individual responsibility alter structures or enable and enact structures, that structures are by themselves insufficient. And here are some of those individuals, which I think are very important in the last sort of 20 years of architectural education. The role of someone like John Hajduk at Cooper Union and what he did there and what sort of tonality and ethos he set in that institution. Or here at the AA, Alvin Boyarsky, who, I put up here curator, horse trainer, because I think that's really the way he operated. Certainly in my tenure here during his time, he was like an incredible horse trainer, who was sort of out there looking at the young fillies and the young colts and seeing which one might come up, take them under their wing, train them up, put them with some other good people at the beginning, and then see how far they could run. A lot of them broke down, had to be shot on the course, pushed over the edge. But it was a kind of cultivating, which I think is interesting. And the same, for me, that's the role of a good curator. It's not somebody who just sort of puts up the stuff. It's actually somebody that does have a direct relationship to its formation within a structural system. And I think that was a role he played. With Libeskind, it was a very kind of singularity of his way of seeing. It's partly the institution at Cranbrook, Academy of Art. But it was also, I think, that's the way he teaches. He doesn't teach in a kind of traditional pedagogy. And it was a choice. You're either there to work with him or you're not, and you leave. I think Bernard set up a kind of incredible model that I say all of us, not as if we're advocating, but I think that he has influenced the discourse very much about what does it mean to both be a practicing architect and a dean simultaneously. It's a kind of nirvana condition, Someone who is engaged in practice, is not just an administrator, not just an academic, and yet someone who's able to give academic and pedagogic direction to an institution while maintaining his professional practice. It may be out of reach, again. It may have only been able to happen fully that one time at Columbia. But as a model, I think it's incredibly important. Peter Cook and Christine Hawley, who have done incredible things, I think, over at the Bartlett. Whether one agrees with all of the work and as it comes out, certainly from when I first came to London in the 70s, the Bartlett was that little thing down the street that nobody ever talked about, except in terms of how many students might come to do their 4th and 5th year studies here. And they've, not only have they made it a very important institution, it's made it a very important won't say opponent, but a counter to the AA. And I think that's good. I think it's good that the AA is no longer so far removed from everyone else in terms of quality, direction, difference, that it can sort of relax. I think it's a very important model that they've set up. And then finally, Robert Stern, not because I have any direct experience with this, but it's always intrigued me in the last sort of 4 or 5 years since Stern took over at Yale, the degree to which he has brought in so many people that he absolutely doesn't like their architecture. It's an incredible model. And in fact, the sort of rise in the status of Yale is based almost entirely on the differences that he's brought in, the difference to himself. That is, the last thing that he's done there is to sort of impose repetitions of his own interests. And that's quite amazing. You know, I would never have believed it. I'm not a big fan of him as an architect at all, but I think he deserves a lot of respect for being able. Now, it may be just a good sales job, and he's certainly increased the profile of the university, but I think it's quite amazing to in a way, go against one's own nature in order to produce a kind of mix that has some relevancy. This is an image of Robert Kerr, and if you've read any of the introductions about the AA, this gentleman, along with Charles Gray, were the people who founded the Architectural Association in 1847. Now, I knew that because it was in all the AA prospectus and publication stuff. What I didn't know until I reread it again recently is that when he and Charles Gray founded the Architectural Association, he was 24 years old, and Charles Gray was 19. Basically, that's saying that you as students in first or second year, you should have founded the AA, not come here to study at it. And the reason I put this image up here is because, and this next image, is because I think the most important thing about the Architectural Association is the second word, not the first. That it was founded as an association. It was founded out of a deep desire to know more about what wasn't yet known. That is to say, the whole founding of the AA was about a few individuals, 19, 23, 24 years old, getting together and deciding that the world was changing too fast and too quickly for them to be left behind or to only be brought up through a sort of apprenticeship system. Now that's radical. That's incredible. It's incredible the sort of gumption of these two guys, along with other people who joined in, to found an association. And I think it's important to keep using that word association because it's different than collective, it's different than organization, it's different than institution. It's an association. And so that means that anyone that is here is associated, which already deals with some questions about hierarchy and levels of engagement. Because in effect, we're all associates at the AA. From the first day you walk in to the last day you get pushed out. And I think that's important. I think it's very important in terms of what sort of effect it has. And I think it's something to hold in mind, if possible, at all times. And with that, you know, the role that Alvin Boyarsky had, because he was the person that was here when I came here. But in coming with that, and in coming with that tenure of Alvin, I put together this little chart. Because again, I think this is another unique qualification of the Architectural Association. This kind of question of lineages. You know, people that start teaching here, who have students who become associates and co-teachers, who then go on to have other students who become other unit masters, other teachers, and so on and so on. The underline just means that they studied here as opposed to having just come here. I wasn't really sure about Elias Zingelis. I'm not sure. I don't remember if he studied here or not. But for me, this has always been it's both one of the most profound aspects, I think, of the AA, but it's also something that has to be looked at. Because sometimes, like any line, sometimes it goes on too long. Look at the royal family, There are lineages and there are lineages. So one has to pay attention to what that means structurally and pedagogically. But it certainly means a kind of evolutionary condition, and I think that is interesting. It's not just a job, like in a lot of schools of architecture. This is an aspect that I think, certainly, I don't know the conversations that have gone on before I got here on Friday, but it's something that when you're not at the AA, you realize again and again how insidiously important it is. And I use the word insidiously because it's about its sort of infiltration. As an association, this is also a social space. And it's unlike any other school I know anywhere. It's not just the unit system, it is a social space. That is to say, all of the schools that I've been to, places like Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, University of Queensland, I can't even remember all the schools that have tried to replicate the unit system. The one thing they don't have is the bar. And it's not just because it's nice to be able to have a beer at lunchtime or in the evening. It's about what it means as a social condition within a city like London, but as in a social condition within any locality. And I think you have to really pay attention to that. And certainly, I remember from when Raoul and I first arrived here, there was a degree to which the bar and after lectures and so forth were more prominent. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. Personally, I think it was. I liked the intensity. I liked the fact that over a beer you could have a good argument. I think somebody said on Friday about real violent confrontations, and somebody said, no, there were never any physical. Well, there were, in the bar, because I remember being a part of some of those. And, but that was good, because it was engaging, and it was serious. It was very serious. And, clearly the AA has an incredible role relative to the lecture series, people from out of school, from around the city, from around the world coming here because of what happens through the lecture series and the exhibitions and so on and so forth. But what I'm really trying to talk about is that there is something quite unique to the utilization of a space like the bar as part of the formation of knowledge. It's not just a good place to go and relax, it's also a forum for exchange and ideas. And that's something I think that's really important. Okay, I just want to finish with just 4 little things here. With the question of risks, for me, it's about establishing how many risks is this place willing to take? How big of a risk? How much of a risk in terms of reformation and redirection and its future? It's a question, not necessarily advocating that it has to be one way or another, but I think it's important to ask, how much are you willing to risk in order to become something different, which is therefore part of the same tradition? And part of that risk is to decide what role does the AA want in the world of architecture and architectural education. Personally, for me, it goes back to the first thing, the deletion test. It's about what can this place do that to not have it here would be serious risk to the whole profession. That is, what can this place undertake that to have it extinguished or denied would have a greater impact than just keeping it going as it is. Money is important, and we all know that, but it's not necessarily important, I think, for exactly the reasons maybe that everybody says. It's important in terms of finding ways to get more students, but actually for me it would be in order to get more students of better quality. You know, it's a good school here, and all the students that are in this room are great students, but there's some other students who are not great. And I think you have to admit that. Because I sat on too many panels, admissions panels, over a long period of time of letting the students in because we needed the money. The school needed the money to keep going. One of the incredible things that I have the fortune of teaching at Cooper Union is that all the students there come for free. They don't have to pay to go to school. There's an incredible endowment that allows them to be there, which means there's an incredible competition to join the school. I've never taught 25 students where more than 50% were smart, but that's what it's like at Cooper Union. Doesn't say they're all great architects yet, but they're smart. And that's a different kind of context. So money is important in terms of its relationship to being able to maintain a different kind of quality here at the school. It's important in terms of salaries. I know that Alan Balfour made mention of this and other people have made mention of this, but there are great people who would probably like to be teaching at the AA who can't afford to teach here. There are people who teach here who can't afford to teach here. And there are people that have taught here for 20-something years that never afforded to teach here for 20 years. You can only imagine their deficit of 20 years. I mean, it's more than United Airlines in that sense. And this question of contracts. I actually think that the one-year contract that tutors serve under here at the AA is an incredible thing. Incredible, actually in a very positive way. I think there would be other forms that would give a bit more security, but I think there's nothing worse than a sort of tenureship in an institution. There's a difference between security and tenure. And in American universities and in a lot of universities in Europe, tenure is the sort of end of the school as a thinking body. And it transfers to those with tenure to those who are attempting to get tenure. And so there's this kind of cycle that goes on. But it requires certain kind of obligations and responsibilities of the institution back to those people that teach. And finally, this question of structure. I mean, this is just a sort of repeat of what I tried to say before, is that structure is highly important. So the question of the unit system is important, the relationship to other schools of architecture and how they're structured, other forms of how pedagogy could be advanced. Absolutely, and I think the more conversation and the more models that are put out there and that one can understand, then that's great. But structure is not just about a kind of structural moment. It's also a question about leadership and the role of someone in that position or positions. I'm not trying to prejudge what it might be. And I think relative to the AA is the one sort of uncertainty, which is the kind of middle ground, which I've just tried to call the collective. And what I mean by that is really, is there a different kind of engagement between administration, leadership, and teaching in terms of setting other possibilities within the school? I don't think, relative to the image I tried to show, that it's that one big black line separating the chair from the rest of the school. And I think it's something that certainly was never contemplated during Alvin Boyarsky. I think aspects of it started to emerge under Alan Balfour, and I don't really actually know under Moysen because I don't really know how it worked, to be quite honest. But I think it is something that is important because there is a kind of collective knowledge and expertise that is more than just running units that could be looked at. And then, obviously, finally, the institution itself. The AA is incredibly important, I think. And, to go back to the beginning is to ask the question, what would happen if it were not here? Would there be anything seriously missing in architecture? Thank you.
Can we take some questions? Francois.
Hi. One question, I would like to pick up 3 points in your presentation and try to see if we can match them together. You presented Alvin more as a kind of a horse trainer. There's also Libeskind, which had more studio director or something like that, and how the one-year contract can be a good thing. I was wondering if that kind of situation could be applied to a chair in the school, like at the head of the school.
Well, you mean the chair having a one-year contract?
Yeah, being in a situation where maybe it's shorter than a 5 or 10 year period.
Well, my understanding is it is 5. It's not an automatic 10 years. Is that right? I think that's right. I think that's good. I think it's good it's only 5. I think the question of renewal could be more, perhaps more structured and more, I hate to use the word accountable because I don't know what that really means, but I think that the forum under which a kind of renewal takes place could be more structured and more visible, and I think that would be good. Because I think you're right. I think one has to have the option of checking. The way it exists with the one-year contract for tutors is there's kind of, on the one hand, if you're totally unsuccessful, theoretically you get to leave or have to leave. If you're, all the students in your unit fail and the work is rubbish and everybody knows it and nobody wants to teach with you or study with you next year, it's clear, you're out. The other is, you're to a certain degree here at the discretion of the chair. So should the chair decide that for all of what you've done, he or she doesn't think it's actually appropriate for the school, then your contract may not be renewed and stuff. But I think what's interesting about that is that means that there are specific sort of judgments based on action. That is to say, there is something there to look at and to see. And there's a kind of condition under which that review takes place. I think that could also, apply to the position of chair. Now, the question of how structured that is as a kind of forum, does everybody vote every 5 years? And, so I don't know. I'm not sure. But I think that, the AA, the very reason we're here now is because the AA, as an association, as opposed to a school, as opposed to a university, has the ability to question itself and engage in its own operation. It's pretty good. May not be perfect, but that's pretty good.
Another question? Maybe while we're waiting for a question, it does seem to me there's a difference between the position of the chair and the position of people who are appointed to teach, in the sense that only the chair is elected, and in that sense only the chair is kind of removed by a vote, if necessary. And so it's an entirely kind of, in that sense, different process. I don't think we've ever had an experience where someone says, well, could we vote to get rid of someone who's running intermediate so-and-so because they've lost the confidence of the unit. They may not be reappointed next year, but I think it's a kind of different logic. Roger.
Yes, thanks. You mentioned at one point about, in terms of your kind of structural, not so much analysis, but your structural recognition of the school, the importance of a thin layer, I think was the way you described it, and the thin layer which she has a kind of intelligent engagement. And I was also very impressed by your statement about the associate nature of the association, the kind of way in which the association kind of dies into anybody that's actually participating. I think there's a huge nervousness in the delicacy of that structure, that any change will somehow collapse it in some kind of way. And yet at the same time, there's equally a kind of desire to try and tease out what are the kind of elements, or how it might change, or how it might improve.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because earlier today, in the discussion about the unit system, Brett Steele had done some homework and looked at, when it formed and under what circumstance and so on and so forth. I don't know enough about, even having been here, I don't really know enough about the history of the AA. It obviously survived under totally different regimes as an association prior to the unit system. So my sense is it could be something totally different and still be an association. I think there is a kind of, relationship, certainly, to some aspects that you raise. But, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny because, when I tried to set up this school in France, it was as a kind of alternative to some of my experiences here and so on and so forth. But actually, as one almost always does, my pursuit of a kind of oppositional position was basically based on the incredible experience of being here at the AA. That is to say that, the sort of opportunities that it afforded in terms of its robustness to be different underwrote my desire to be different, And so my sense is that one of the absolute powers of the AA is its self-determining nature. It's not incorporated through the state. It's not even incorporated, even if it subscribes to RIBA accreditation and ARB and does all of those kind of things. It also helps to define that, I mean, what is now allowed at many schools of architecture in this country is because it happened at the AA, and somehow we cajoled the external examiners to give it a pass. So it has a performative role to the institution, not just responding to the institutions like the RIBA and the ARB and such. And it has to be accredited. It goes through that whole thing, that whole rigmarole of people coming in here and being the judges and jury over what's being done here. But for me, interestingly, it still means that its own destiny is in its own hands, which I think is very unique. And therefore, in response, my sense is that it has a robustness. It's delicate, but it also is robust at the same time to allow for alteration, should that be desired.
You have experience with Cooper Union and AA, so I was just wondering, apart from smart students in Cooper Union, what's the special characteristics of Cooper Union? Because like AA, I think it's the faculty, the close relationships, the interactions. What is it with the Cooper Union? Yeah,
actually not really. I think the Cooper Union is very different from the AA. You don't actually have a lot of interaction between levels. I'm in charge of third year. I have 3 people that work with me, and basically we talk amongst ourselves. You don't have a social space like you do here. You have reviews, and you have people from some of the other years or from outside of the school that come and sit. But it's much. It's hard to describe. There is a profound difference in terms of how should I say this? A kind of enveloping that takes place here compared to there. There, things are much more categorically distinct, I would say. I think here at the AA, there are opportunities and situations that blend and merge across domains, whether it's between intermediate and diploma, first year, graduate school, different parts of graduate school, general studies, evening lecture series, exhibitions, and so on and so forth. It is still it's a community here in a way that's different than being an educational school, a school like you have at Cooper Union. I mean, the difference there is that, it, like a lot of American schools, it operates based on a kind of studio. That is, all the students have desks at school in studio, and they're basically there, till 2 o'clock every morning. So if you want to go give a tutorial at 2 o'clock, you know where they should be. And that's something that I've always found a bit frustrating at the AA, also having come from experiences like that in Houston and at Cranbrook. But the one thing that, again, this is why I say the sort of social dimension of the AA is something not to be underestimated in both its effect, but also its uniqueness.
I think one difference is that at Cooper Union the students talk about New York. Here they just talk about the AA. Valentine.
Thank you. No, well, first, thank you for your comments about those very stupid people who made allegations about Alan Bethell's lectures. But then again about the contract, shouldn't be for tutors, shouldn't maybe even be less than 1 year, in the sense that if only 2 or 3 students apply for a unit, then those tutors shouldn't be even given the chance to run a unit for a year, but so that those 2 or 3 students should be given the chance to get in the unit more desired. And I guess therefore it would also make a more competitive atmosphere between the units, which is very good because it would make each unit more provocative.
Well, I can think of nothing more competitive than trying to make a good unit out of 3 students. It's hard work. No, I mean, look, I think that, I don't know who these people are, but I think one of the great things is, even though it's, quote, 1-year contracts, I think most of the chairs, certainly Boyorski was this way, usually undertook to give somebody a sort of 2 or 3 year go at it. Because I think, popularity is not the same as good teaching, and, I think it's very easy to look back through the brochures and we could point to units that started off with 3 or 4 students because what they were doing, what they brought into the school in the first year was not what the AA does. So there's this question of, we only want to learn what we already know, what we like. So I think one of the roles of any chair is giving that kind of support. It's not just the fact that some people move halfway around the world to live in the most expensive city in the world to get paid the worst salary in any school of architecture in the world, and then are told on the first day of class, sorry, it didn't work out. But it's also, I think it's also about, that I think true architectural pedagogy is not something you repeat. It's something you evolve and develop. And so therefore I think you need the opportunity to have a serious go at it. If after 2 or 3, say 3 years, it still doesn't work out, then yeah, you're probably not the right person to be here, but that's much clearer. So, I think that's, the question to me says as much about the timidness of students as it does about the inadequacy of tutors.
Valentine.
I just want to take you up on the question, what would happen to the debate in architecture if the AA wouldn't be here? Because I started to think, what would really happen? Would that be so bad? Because I thought if the AA went missing, or if actually it did go missing, and everybody started to look for it and copy it, like I think which actually happened, you could see it in the workshop. For example, we were able to do quite a lot of different things, but what happened, because Europe came around, we had to suddenly wear goggles. We suddenly couldn't shift one machine around anymore and do all sorts of different things. So we became quite limited in a lot of ways. So did that also happen to us, because suddenly everybody found us, and now maybe we're not really around anymore. So what would you think is the most radical way to go even more missing, so that we actually would be contributing to this point where you said the Architectural Association is still doing that?
Well, I don't know if it's about going missing. I mean, partly I don't know. I mean, if I had the answer, I'd probably, say I was a candidate or something. But I don't know. All I'm trying to say is that exactly because other schools, quote, are doing what the AA used to do, other schools, and the AA itself is, quote unquote, some people have said it's a lot like some of the other schools. Some people have said it should be more like other schools. It should do some of the stuff. My sense was, and this is why I had a fundamental difference of opinion or position with Moyson, was, for me, the last thing the AA needed to be was Harvard at Bedford Square, because Harvard already exists. The one thing that didn't exist anyplace else was the AA. Now, that's not just because it's here and that's there and so it's over, but it's about a particular way of working. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily the best way for success, and I think one could have a lot of debates about the efficacy of what is taught here and what students do when they get out of here. How good of students are they? But you would have to say that, if you took a list of, for the last 25 to 30 years, of people that went to school here and what they're now doing, you'd say it's still influential. Now part of that's the individuals, but it's also, I think, the institution. So therefore, I think you can have a position that says we can remain unlike any place else as one of the major conditions of our existence. Now what that unlikeness is actually based on, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I would have some of my own opinions, but I think that it for me, it's that's why it's a kind of fundamental question of, does the AA want to be a really good school in the context of all schools, or does it want to be a totally different school in the context of other schools?
To add a point to that, which I think is, you talked about, possibly the AA feeling fragile. The gentleman who asked the question about tutors talked about popularity and so on. And I think it's probably quite important to, in relation to Valentine's point, to say that the AA has survived all these other forces from the outside, and I think the relationship with ARP and the RIBA has always been pretty good through all these chair people. And I think lately there has been this fear of fragility, and a lack to see the robustness that you're talking about, and you're one of the few people who've spoken about it as part of the AA and also coming from outside. But I think the AA, the fear from the outside did not exist before, and I think it actually has to do something with that idea of popularity and being seen to be popular on the outside world. Because Alvin did not in any way make life easy with the outside world. If he could pick a fight, he did. But we all survived pretty well, and when we've had the validations, we've done pretty well too. So I think that individuality of fighting one's own ground, I think, is one of the strengths. So I think the idea of tutors being Spice Girls that you vote on and see whether they're top 10 is completely erroneous. It really has to be in another way. And the same way with definition of what architecture might be and its relationship to the outside. And I think the AA is now in a position to move forward to do that. And I think a lot of this was discussed earlier, but I think I really agree with you that it's an evolution of a school. It's not an invention or going out to buy one and looking at a model somewhere else. And I think one of the things that was interesting about those categories that you put down for all the different heads of school was the variety in them. Quite amazing. They should all be boring people who just buy new paper, if you see what I mean, in a way. But the fact that they all managed to do different schools in different ways, I think that's very positive, and that's what we should be looking forward to.
Maybe we could just pause on that point, actually. I mean, I'm surprised that in some sense there haven't been more questions about that sort of typology of kind of deans that Don put up. Though I did notice discretion intervened and we did not get a characterization of Dean Vidler at the Cooper Union.
It's too early.
And, you know, I suspect that the one that students, I was genuinely expecting the question in some sense, was really, you know, when you mentioned Bernard as someone who had evidently and very successfully combined being both a dean while maintaining a practice with offices both in New York and Paris, I sort of feel there must be students kind of wanting to know what the secret to that was.
Well, I'd like to know too. I mean, you know, then you'd have plenty of job offers around the world. I don't know. I mean, as I tried to say, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think it was a particular moment in the time of Columbia University. I think it was a particular moment in Bernard's life and his time. And it may well have been a particular moment in the evolution of general architectural pedagogy. That is to say that there was still that possibility of someone who had not been, particularly in an American university context, where they had not been consigned to being a fundraiser, who also happened to be the head of a school. And, you know, whether that's able to be replicated or not, I don't know. I certainly think it has a lot to do with the individual, Bernard, but you know, it is an important example. I wouldn't say it's a prototype or archetype, but it's certainly an important example that I think has to be looked at, you know, because I know that when the last real election took place 9 years ago, that was put forward. And my understanding was that it was more or less rejected from the committee that was drawing up the contracts and stuff. And whether the school agreed to that or not might have been a different question, because it was never put forward to the school.
Is there a last question? No? Then on your behalf, I'd like to thank Don very much. Don, thank you. Okay, we're going to move